to the pace of some of the reforms, because you're talking about 25 years post-Kyoto Protocol. Where are we now? And of course, with the adverse impacts faced in Kenya, in the Horn of Africa, and of course, in the entire continent, this Kusi Ideas Festival could not have come at a better time. So, Daktari, karibu sana. Okay. So I think we might require an extra seat, if we can get an extra seat, because we also have to welcome the UNDP resident representative, who is also joining us here. It would be good also to get some impact and information from her as well. So as Dr. James Mwambi is going to be introducing his panel, but of course, we have, of course, Her Excellency Honorable Anne Waiguru. Of course, we also have Professor Fai Koyen. And of course, the resident representative is joining us. We have the CS and Dr. James Mwangi. So I think we are set. So we're just waiting for Miss Elsie Atafo to join us as well. There she comes. Karibu sana.
Thank you, Elsie. If you could join us. Thank you very much. And let's start off. I guess the high-level panelists are very familiar with everybody, so for the sake of time, allow me to save the few minutes that would have gone to introduction, because I've been strictly advised to stop at 12:30, so I have less than an hour. So let's get to the basics, Professor Patrick, and help us really differentiate between climate change and environmental change.
Well, thank you so much, James. Before I get to that particular question, I just want to say, first of all, what's good for Africa is good for the world. I mean, and that's no more, is that more true than with the climate emergency. And I think all of us joining this festival have the same perception that Africa is unstoppable. And as the Honorable Minister just indicated on behalf of the President, Africa at the same time is at the crossroads in the sense of recovering from the COVID crisis, being impacted by the war in Ukraine. It did not cause, I mean, debt crisis up, inflation up, food price up, energy price up. And then on top of that, there is the climate crisis. In fact, Honorable Minister, as you already referenced, Africa is at ground zero of the climate crisis. I mean, think about it. 9 of the 10 most vulnerable countries worldwide to the climate crisis happen to be in Africa. Less than 3% of greenhouse gas emissions are emitted from Africa. So there's a profound moral injustice in the global system vis-à-vis the climate crisis, which has to be addressed. So in essence, for me, that was the backdrop of COP27 a few weeks ago in Egypt, indeed. And I think the positive thing of what happened in Egypt was that African leaders came united. Not just saying climate emergency is real and is impacting Africa, not just saying it is important to finance, but they came forward with a very concrete plan. President Ruto, together with President Macky Sall, chairperson of the African Union, the president of Ghana, and other presidents, put on the table a very concrete material plan, the so-called Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP. What is it? It's a $25 billion program over 5 years for Africa, led by Africa, to be implemented in Africa. So in Sharm el-Sheikh, that AAAP, that program, the largest program in the world, was center stage. And African leaders said, well, actually, we are putting our money on the table against that plan. where are you, Western world, in financing that plan? So the outcome of COP27 was that certain financial commitments were on the table, which were appreciated, but at the moment, James, it is not enough. The AAAP in and of itself will invest in digital climate solutions for Africa, for agriculture, invest in resilient infrastructure, also here in Kenya, will invest in jobs and adaptation. Because what I suspect, what Madam Governor already indicated, we can have summits, we can even have festivals like today. At the end of the day, the litmus test is, what does it do for a mother in Mukuru who is battling her life because the floods are hitting her daily livelihood? What does it do for a young girl in Makwene County who has lost her livelihood because the droughts are coming? So I think there is a profound opportunity to really transform the agenda. Maybe James, allow me also to use, as a non-African, to use an African proverb. I mean, the Honorable Chairperson said, well, there's no shortcut to the top of a palm tree, and that might be true. But when I was in Makwene County a few weeks ago, I was met by the local community, by women leaders, and they sang a song upon my arrival, and they said, when you climb a mountain, there are good things on top of it. So when you climb a mountain, there are good things on top of it. And that good thing is investing in adaptation. It is investing against the climate shocks which we face today and which we will face tomorrow. Why? Because it's a jobs agenda, it's a growth agenda, it is a development agenda. So I think there's a huge opportunity to transform this climate debate, indeed, to answer your question, James, in a development agenda.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I hope, CS, you have now captured your breath. And we could really talk about the ramification, the implication of what we are going through to our motherland, Kenya. And Kenya is being hit from two opposite sides of climate change. In some parts of the country, the worst drought in 40 years has left almost 14 million people in the Horn of Africa, including Kenya, hungry and dependent on emergency food aid. It has killed tens of thousands of herds of cattle and destroyed livelihoods. In other areas, like the Rift Valley, which I guess you are very familiar with, lakes are flooding and large areas of land where people were living, where schools stood, and tourism businesses were located, has been swallowed by water. What does this mean to Kenya?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mwangi. And in this one, I'm not reading the president's speech. I'm speaking as a Kenyan and as a CS environment. Of course, what this pushes us to think about is adaptation strategies. It pushes us to think about the box and go into alternatives. An immediate one of which is to engage in climate smart agriculture, to talk to our populations, to adopt alternative means of livelihoods. And immediately you talk about that, the need for financial support checks in. With the droughts, just like the whole climate action at the global level is now heavily informed by science. We are getting very almost real-time support through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on what needs to be done in our mitigation efforts. I think we will need to invest heavily in early warning systems. And I'm happy that that discussion got to an advanced level during the just concluded COP27, where we now have discussions around a fund to support technology that needs to go into mitigating effects of climate change so that we don't have to do firefighting year in, year out around our drought situations. We have a lot of water around us, and in the government's manifesto, we are talking about very instrumental reforms that need to go into the water space, so that a lot of water that we have around us should not be for catastrophes where it deals as blows in terms of droughts, but we turn it around to make sure that we have sustainable livelihoods that can be supported throughout the year. And the whole discussion about climate financing, I'm happy that the Global Center on Adaptation is here. That cannot be overemphasized. The need for financial flow to go towards adaptation, mitigation. The global goal on adaptation, again, is a positive that we picked during the COP27 that we are now pushing towards actualization. We need to unpackage the new fund around loss and damage so that we have a clear, transparent framework of funding that translates into action. Thank you.
Patrick, CS has introduced two concepts, adaptation and mitigation. Do you wish to differentiate the two for us?
Well, that's basically climate talk. And if I try to explain that to my children, I'm working on climate, on mitigation and adaptation. Nobody understands it, and I think that's actually the problem, part of the problem, right? We need to do a couple of things. One, we need to lower our carbon footprint, of course, but at the same time, we need to prepare ourselves for the shocks which we're already experiencing in a 1.2 degrees warmer world. What have we learned from the IPCC report was released recently? That we will hit 1.5 no matter what we do by 2030. But that's 1.5 degrees warmer on average. That might be much higher in Africa alone. We're seeing the impacts of the current reality today. Let's imagine how 2030 would look like. So the call to the world is to lower the carbon footprint, i.e. mitigate, and at the same time reduce the impact of climate change, i.e. adapt. Because at the end of the day, James, as indicated by the Honorable Cabinet Secretary, it is adapt or die.
Cabinet Secretary, back to you. We might be lucky that you might introduce another concept. But you talked about our four mothers. Let's stick to three for the time being. If we were to list two things that Mother Kenya must do, and another two that Mother Africa must do while looking upon the world, for that matter, to enable us to survive the worst impact of climate change, what would they be?
Thank you very much. I think for Mother Kenya, I said we are trailblazing in the run-up to 100% renewable energy, which is great. But I still think that what we can do best is the nature-based solutions, which I have elaborated during my speech, that of growing trees. But as we do that, we must drive that hand in hand with alternatives to deflect attention from over-reliance on our forests. As it stands right now, we have 80% of our populations relying on biomass. So as we plant 15 billion trees and still have 80% of Kenyans depending on charcoal and firewood for domestic fuels, then we might not be making much progress. And the alternatives are in abundance, where we need to be talking about energy-saving cooking initiatives, improved cook stoves, creating incomes for our women and youth through the making of briquettes and all these other alternatives of fuels at the domestic level, and that way we will even mitigate against adverse health effects that come through the use of firewood and charcoal, the biomass. We also have invasive species which have become a menace, death-causing and destabilizing livelihoods for big populations of this country. When you go to some of the arid and semi-arid areas, we have the prosopis plant, which everyone knows the mathenge and the effect it has on the people and their livelihoods. We have the opuntia in the north, and all these species, as they, wreak havoc on livelihoods, they also present opportunities for livelihoods expansion. I think we need to think about that. We need to go that direction. For Africa, and as the leader of KAHOS that Kenya is right now, we will be pushing and persuading our neighbors to, we are talking about mitigation, reducing our release of greenhouse gas emissions. We have all spelled this out in our NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. I think the plastics menace is what we need to agree from a collective viewpoint. One of the biggest challenges we are facing as a country is that we took a bold step to ban the use of single-use plastics, but because our neighbors may not have had the same direction, then we are faced with the porous borders. But if we are all to agree and come up with a collective initiative to phase out, and not phase down, phase out plastics, I think we can be moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's come to Excellency Governor Waiguru. The devolved counties in Kenya are key implementers of climate change programs and actions, something that you rarely see in most African countries. The County Climate Change Fund finances climate projects identified and prioritized by local communities. How much money has been disbursed through CCF, and are you able to evaluate successes so far?
Thank you very much for that question. As you heard, the country passed a Climate Change Act 2016 that required both at the national level and at the county level for us to have 5-year plans that outline the strategies and interventions that we will be implementing for climate change, both to mitigate against the effects of climate change and also to support adaptation mechanisms. At the county level, we had an omnibus bill which most of the counties have passed at the local level to enable them to implement. One of the things that the bill requires, as I said in my speech, is that counties allocate about 1 to 3% of their development budget to climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. So far, we have collectively amongst all the counties approximately 877 million shillings that have been put in the department that deals with climate change, the various departments across the counties, and are used to provide interventions for both mitigation and adaptation. If I would give an example of the things that happened, for example, in Marsabit County, they have used the resources to provide, working with the community, water collection ponds, which is the small dams, so that communities are not completely devastated during a period when we have drought. We have also other counties that have gone ahead to provide their communities with drought-resistant seedlings so that they can plant varieties that are more adaptable to the changing environmental climate. We have other counties that have also involved their communities in waste management initiative, and to deal with that issue of, for example, dealing with plastics and recycling and diverting from the use of non-biodegradable things to those that are biodegradable. So there's very many interventions that counties are carrying out at the local level. I think I should emphasize that it's well and good to have a conversation like this one in Kusi, where people at this level, allow me to call you elites, have a conversation on what it is that we need to do. It's good because most of the people who sit here are policymakers and influencers. But the actual implementation with regard to mitigation and adaptation has to happen at the sub-national level, which is at the county level, and even for us, have to go way below the county level, to the sub-county level, and to the ward level, to the communities. These communities will need a lot of education to understand what do they mean by climate change and how does that affect me. I'll give you an example of one of the examples I gave even in COP27 when I was asked, how do I see the climate change having affected me personally? When I was growing up, we have this river in Kirinyaga called Nyamindi River. In fact, it was in one of our geography books as one of the largest rivers in Kenya with a lot of water. If today you cross the bridge of Nyamindi River, and I cross it every time I'm going home, when I'm in the county going to see my mother, you will see the gorge, and you will see where the water levels used to reach. And then even when it has rained, we never get to anywhere near what the water levels were. And this river flows directly from Mount Kenya. And it's not the only river. If you look at the other rivers around our counties, you will see very many that have dried. If you just drive, when you're driving through the road towards Nyeri, just look at between Keno and the Sagana River. There are quite a number of rivers that we knew when we were growing up had water. And today it has rained and there is no water. They are just little gorges. That is an impact of climate change. We need to do something about it. And that is why I'm very excited about the initiative by His Excellency, the President, on planting of trees. It's one way because of the catchment areas and the effect of the loss of catchment areas and the effect of that on our rain and also on our environment at large. I think involving county governments, to involve communities, to understand how they are individually affected by the aspects of climate change will make it more useful, and we will have more impact when we have the communities involved in the mitigation and educating them where we do not have a choice on adaptation and mechanisms to cope with the challenges of climate change. Yeah.
Governor Waiguru, you remind me, as I was also growing up in the villages, the streams that used to be in the village, they are no more. The butterflies I used to chase and play around with, my children can no longer play. They are no longer there. So climate change is real, and it's in a very practical ways. But what lessons can we export from the early implementation of the programs to other African countries?
I think, as you have heard, we are actually way ahead of many countries because we have the initiatives that have been set up, the law at the national level and the laws at the sub-national level. That is one of the things that we can export to other African countries. I think a place to start is always the legislation and the mechanism and the policies that enable you to put resources and then have plans that can be actually monitored in terms of implementation. So one of the lessons that we can give the rest of Africa is that there is a necessity of having the policymakers prioritize legislation and policies that have to do with support of adaptation and mitigation against climate change. That is one. The second thing that we can export to other countries, and I have listened to President Kagame's speech, and I have heard that they have initiatives even in other countries. In Rwanda, I have listened to the Vice President of Tanzania, and they have a robust program of planting trees. I think one of the things that Kenyans can export to Africa is our enthusiasm to do things that are exciting. Kenyans we are very enthusiastic generally about things that are exciting, and I think that is why the minister would come up with initiatives that will get Kenyans involved, like the mothers, planting trees for mothers. If you tell Kenyans to plant a tree for the mothers, they will plant trees for mothers because they place mothers in a very special place. If you tell them that on Christmas Day, instead of having to cut trees, let us decorate a live tree. I'm sure we are going to be seeing very interesting trees decorated this Christmas season, because that is how Kenyans are. We are enthusiastic about getting involved in things that are of positive nature, and that is one of the things that I think we can export. But more than that, I think the initiatives that we are implementing at the sub-national level with our communities, and especially our leaders, our governors are getting involved at a personal level to ensure that their communities that they are serving are educated through civic education initiative. That is one thing that is very unique with Kenya. Public participation is a very unique concept to Kenya, and I think it's something that we can export to other countries in Africa to engage their communities in this initiative so that all of us own this challenge of climate change and find ways to adapt and also to restore, as Waziri said, that we will continue to plant the trees the way we are. At least we will start the healing process of the effects of the devastations that we ourselves have brought on ourselves. And I say that not just as Africans, but the human population at large in the world, because we know as much as Africa is a very minimal contributor to the effects of climate change, we are the ones who are most affected by the atrocities that come because of the adverse effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elsie, we have heard from technical experts, we have heard from county, central government. This issue goes beyond an individual organization. UN, and particularly UNDP, is very well positioned to play a catalytic role, to use its gravitas to mobilize the entire universe to one single purpose. We witnessed huge achievement in Egypt, COP27. There was the establishment of loss and damage fund to give financial assistance to countries that are most vulnerable and impacted by the effects of climate. Part of the idea is that these countries that they suffer most from fallout of climate change and hardly contribute anything will be supported. What was your take when this resolution was passed?
So first of all, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. All right. First of all, let me bring you greetings from the Pearl of Africa, Uganda, and to also thank the Nation Media Group for inviting me, and by extension, by inviting the United Nations Development Program. Dr. Mwangi, I also can say we are friends. So, Mr. Moderator, I also have friends here. Yeah. Perhaps before we get into the conversation of what my reflections are on loss and damage, I think it's quite important to frame the conversation from a development point of view, because it's quite important that we are together when it comes to the intersection between climate change and development. And I think that was part of the broad conversation that I was supposed to speak to. But I'll come back to the loss and damage question. I draw a lot of inspiration from the CS, and I draw a lot of inspiration from the governor as well when they're talking about rivers. And let me start off with a story about the Renzoris. 2 years ago now, we have been supporting expedition to the Renzoris, and arguably one of the most beautiful mountain ranges on earth is in Uganda. And I know you have the Mount Kenya here, but I can say that it's equally beautiful. Now, the glaciers are melting. And somebody will ask, but what has it got to do with us? The glaciers melting. And I'm trying to position the conversation around development. With the glaciers melting, obviously, we know that those downstream who are dependent on the glaciers for agriculture are being impacted. We know that that mountain has a great potential for tourism. When the glaciers go, your tourism will be impacted. We know that those who grow coffee, Arabica, in highland areas, because of the warming temperatures, you're going to be affected. So there's a trade dimension to it. And we know that because of the melting glaciers, we have floods where floods are not supposed to be, okay? Taking away schools, taking away health centers, and therefore you see loss and damage. Now, what am I saying? All I'm saying is that there's a clear intersection between climate change and health, climate change and trade, climate change and food security, and many more. And therefore, from a developmental point of view, because I know most of the time we decouple development from climate change, it's one and the same. And therefore, there are imperatives for Africa. And I'll come back to your loss and damage question, because I think we need to situate the conversation as a whole. Now, having situated the links and the nexus between climate and therefore development, what does it mean for Africa? What are the imperatives for Africa? And therefore, we come back to the loss and damage fund. What does it mean? Now, you would need a fund like that ultimately to push certain agendas, not only on loss and damage, agenda on trade, for example. There's clear interlinkages, particularly when it comes to the Africa Free Trade Continental Area Agreement, where you need to be able to drive funding to even address the impact of climate on trade. You also need to do a lot of things when it comes to how do you use funding from that instrument, for example, to address your energy question. In Africa, for example, I think global funding to Africa in renewables is only 2% out of the entire funding that is coming to the region. So that becomes very, very important. You also need that to respond to your adaptation question and also resilience question. And therefore, coming back to the reflections, Dr. Mwangi on a loss and damage fund, absolutely important. And I think we applaud all the negotiators, African ministers who were there pushing for 30 years. Finally, it comes. But what we have to ask ourselves is how are we positioning Africa to take advantage of this fund if it's eventually capitalized? Well, we have seen in the past, for example, that African countries did not benefit from the clean development mechanisms. And therefore, we can be clapping our hands and jumping, but how do we position? And I think that excellencies and ministers here, governors, we need to pay a lot more attention to how do we operationalize that loss and damage fund? How do we position Africa to make sure that we have a voice as it's being created? How do we position Africa to make sure that it's agile enough for us to be able to benefit from that? And I say that in case because also when you look at even the whole conversation we're having on carbon markets, for example, the markets are there, but if we don't take care and we don't align our regulations and our laws and our policies, we may not take advantage of the carbon markets. And that same holds true also for the loss and damage fund. So in terms of reflections, generally speaking, I think this offers an opportunity for us to drive the adaptation agenda, to drive the resilience agenda, to really make sure that when the rains come and the floods come and your roads are destroyed and your hospitals are destroyed and the schools are destroyed, then how do you have a fund that helps you to assess and to be able to remedy the damage that has been said? So overall, these are some of the reflections, but of course, I hope that I can speak to some of the major issues around climate for development that is quite important for the Africa region.
Absolutely. We must see this as a huge opportunity for development so that we proactively. Elsie, next time you talk about, there is a lake here called Aberdare in Kenya, equally as beautiful. What would you say to the skeptics who have already thrown wax in the spans saying, we have seen this before? Is really they are going to be funds that will flow to the low-income countries?
I mean, talking about the the skeptics on loss and damage or skeptics on loss and damage?
Yeah, loss and damage.
Listen, I think when the Mr. Kiboro, okay, because the Ugandans do cheat, so I wasn't quite sure. Yeah, when he spoke about why the Kusi ideas, he talked about Pan-Africanism, reimagining, and I think we need to take a step back as Africans and not to be spectators or not to be lamenting. We need to position ourselves as Africans. I think for me, that's what I'm going to say. Position ourselves means that we need to be engaging in that process around the fund operationalization, utilization, capitalization, who is going to put in money. And for example, when the definitions are being done and saying the most vulnerable countries, who are the most vulnerable? You know, we know Africa is the most vulnerable, but how do we position ourselves for that? And I think the times that we are in, Mr. Dr. Mwangi, Africa, I'm a scholar of international relations, okay? Countries have permanent interest and not permanent friends. Africa needs to look at its interest within this loss and damage fund. And therefore, what would it take for us to take advantage of that? That would also mean, like I said, we need to look back at our institutions, our national planning authorities, our environmental protection agencies. How are they positioned to be able to, because there's going to be a lot of science. How would you demonstrate that because you have loss and damage as a result of climate change? How would you demonstrate that? There's a science to it that we need to prepare for. So obviously, there's a lot more that calls for us to work together as government partners, policymakers, civil society, research institutions, our universities, and many more to look into that. But I don't want us to narrow the conversation, Dr. Mwangi, on loss and damage, because I think coming to the Kusi Festival, there is a lot more to financing for Africa beyond loss and damage. And there are a few of them that I wanted to highlight, if you may. For example, I think I talked about the issues around carbon markets. That is very important. When His Excellency Paul Kagame spoke, he talked about the fact that we have a lot of things. We have forests, we have peatlands, we have wetlands, and all these things are there. And how do we use this to position Africa, for example, on the question of carbon pricing? Because the markets are there, but some African countries are getting $10, somebody's getting $35. How do we aggregate our full potential as African to be able to influence the price setting? How do we look at joint registries, for example? How do we make sure that we have joint pipelines, regional approaches to some of these things? So let's not narrow the conversation too much to the loss and damage, because I think this is going to come into the pipeline perhaps 5 years, 10 years from now. And therefore, what is before us in terms of financing that we can take advantage of? And I think the carbon market is one of those. The second one is also really around adaptation financing. We need to push for that, for the adaptation fund. But beyond that, how do we use public finance, for example, to leverage some more from the private sector? How do we use our nationally determined contributions as a locomotive to be able to leverage more financing into the work that we do? And these are spaces that we need to reflect on: adaptation financing, carbon markets, but even creating wealth within the continent is also a source of financing for us. Look, if you take issues around green minerals, for example, African countries are sitting on lithium, ore, graphite, rare earth. The last thing we want is that our sand is taken elsewhere, processed, and brought back to us in lithium-ion batteries for us to buy. How do we create wealth? How can Kenya partner with Uganda or Zambia or DRC that sits on a lot of these things? And I know that a lot of private sector colleagues here, including yourself, Dr. Mwangi, from Equity, we need to start reflecting on how do we create wealth within the continent to be able to also address some of our climate needs, so that we don't export our wealth and import poverty. Because I wanted to build this linkage so that we are not quite narrow in our reflections around financing. And then I think finally, if I may, we need to look at new instruments, including on insurance and risk financing, which becomes very important when we start the conversations around disaster risk reduction. And I know earlier on, I think, Honorable Minister, you were talking about the need for early warning systems, climate information, and all that. That is very important, but can we design schemes, for example, that when the droughts come, the insurance kicks in from the private sector? These are spaces that we need to start reflecting. I hope that Kusi will be able to take some of these conversations forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Also, a really great passion there. Give it to her. Yeah, thank you very much.
I came all the way from Uganda, so you better give me a round of applause again.
Yeah.
On a lighter note.
And looks like the private sector has really been challenged. Peter, it looks like my panel didn't have the private sector. Can I ask for a mic to be given to you and see whether you can respond to that challenge? What is the role of the private sector in this conversation?
Thank you, eminent panel, but also thank you, James, my colleague in private sector. I was about to ask you, what challenge? I think the first thing that I say from private sector, and we normally think about it as CEOs in private sector, as operators in private sector, we cannot succeed in our businesses if our communities are vulnerable. Or our communities are affected. And we know whether that is around all the elements that have been spoken about affect our communities. Today, the drought, which James and I are in a committee which is responding to the drought, is affecting half of the counties in this country. And there's no way private sector can be on the sidelines and be able to watch for without actually intervening. So therefore, and we know also the government can't do this alone. So therefore, we need to partner with government, both national, but also private and also international. I was at COP27, and I'm going to be making a few comments about my observation from there. But for me, it's about coming together and speaking with one voice, making commitments that potentially are science-based. In most cases, if we are able to measure. Certainly within our business at Safaricom, we go for science-based commitments. Hitting some of those areas that have been spoken about, whether that's planting trees, commitments around mitigation, but also much more commitments around adaptation. We can bring innovation, we can bring technology, we can leverage our muscle through the networks that we have to drive the reach of community for the financing that is available. So for me, it's about commitment, but more importantly, about action. It's only if we act, and we act together with local community, that we'll be able to deliver the outcomes we want. Thank you.
So it's good to hear. The private sector has gone beyond profit, has gone to beyond planet. It has really become people-centric. And when it comes to people-centric, it's about shared prosperity. It's about winning the trust of host communities. It's really taking host communities as major stakeholders. And so their pains are the pains of the private sector. When we talk about half of the country is in drought, it means half of our customers are affected. So there is a direct correlation. And as we think this conversation, it goes beyond the central government, it goes beyond the county government, it goes beyond the development institutions like UNDP, it goes beyond centers that are really focused. But your voice here may count. Do you want to jump into the conversation?
Actually, I want to respond to the colleague from the private sector and also to the representative from the UNDP. As an extraordinary pragmatic person I am, my main question is, show me the money. Because we heard about we need commitments and commitments and commitments. Well, actually, there are commitments. There are commitments since 2009 that $100 billion will flow from north to south each and every year. Reconfirmed in 2015. How much money is flowing now? 80 billion. There is a commitment last year from Glasgow that adaptation finance, which is how much today, 20 billion globally, should double. Hasn't happened yet. Because the numbers speak for themselves. What are the adaptation finance needs for the continent, for the African continent, based on the submission of country programs, such as in Kenya? If you add it all up, what is that number? $51 billion a year. How much money is currently flowing to that agenda today? $11 billion. So there's a massive gap, increasing every single year of $40 billion. And indeed, the private sector needs to come in, particularly on adaptation, because at the moment, it's only 97% come from public sources, so just 3% from the private sector. So for me, it is, we can make commitments, and new commitments, and indeed, as the colleague from UNEP indicated, a new facility on loss and damage. Let's not hold our breath too much, right? That facility, it doesn't exist yet. It's still under negotiation. We had something similar 20 years ago, a breakthrough. An adaptation fund was put on the table, was agreed. 20 years later, how much money is in that adaptation fund? In total, $1 billion. Well, if you compare it to the scale of what is needed, I think there's quite an issue here. So I think Africa, as it is tired of waiting, yes, of course, it should partner with the global north because it is, quite frankly, James, if I may say, be a slightly more explicit, it's a travesty that the Western world is able to mobilize $20 trillion overnight to invest in the COVID crisis within the OECD and cannot live up to the commitments which they've made year after year after year. So my bet, my suggestion is that Africa should continue to lead the way, as Kenya is, quite frankly, the global champion on climate adaptation. There are two things which I think, just using the metaphor of the Honorable Minister, what we can learn from Mother Africa. One is to unleash its youth. Indeed, Africa is the youngest continent. And as a recent Humboldt graduate myself from the University of Nairobi, I know how much ingenuity, how much boldness there is within the youth constituency in Africa. That's why I'm delighted also just to point out to Aramid, sitting somewhere a little bit hidden. Aramid, please stand up. Aramid is leading on a very important initiative, the Youth Adapt Challenge. What is that? Very short. Indeed, applaud for Aramid, because what is it? It is supporting young, particularly female entrepreneurs in Africa to invest and bet in climate adaptation. There are extraordinary good examples here in Kenya, across the continent, of young entrepreneurs. Let me give you one example. Here in Kenya, close to Nairobi, there is a young entrepreneur, Caroline. See, her business is what? Selling drought-tolerant seedlings. But she said, well, now I have a little business, but actually I want to grow, I want to scale. This has to go to scale. I don't know how to do that. So this youth challenge gave her $100,000 to grow her business. So I think there is massive opportunity on the continent to drive this agenda. The second and last point, James, is also to mention Mother Africa, its virtue of the capacity of listening. Anju was here with us. Anju, please stand. Is leading on a specific program, which is concrete, led and bred from Kenya, from Makuru, where, because the Makuru people, the Makuru community is the first community in the world who put on the table a master plan on how to link climate and development. And what we're doing now is supporting and rolling out that master plan and link it to the financiers. Here is the plan. This is what is needed because that's what the community thinks what is needed. The money needs to be connected. And we need to replicate the Makurus of Kenya across the continent. So I think there is an extraordinary opportunity for two things which are vital: scale and speed. Yes, climate summits are important to keep everybody accountable, all of us accountable. What have you promised? Now it's all for all of us. Let's deliver on that promise.
Patrick, I think you have provoked me with a follow-up question. In Africa, there is a criticism about a lot of green initiatives, with the argument that industrialized nations grew rich on fossil fuels. And now they are pressurizing Africa to rely on renewable power for their growth. What is your take on this?
Let me go back to a conversation I had just a few weeks ago at COP27 with President Macky Sall in a setting like this, on a stage, with this question was not posed to me, it was posed to him. And the question was, indeed, you're Senegal, you are now the chairperson of the African Union. You have vast reserves of gas. should that not be used for the benefit of the Western world, or should that gas stay where it is today? And I would think, I mean, Macky Sall was extraordinarily explicit. He said, it is quite shocking that on the one hand, Western leaders are visiting my presidential palace and reaching out to me to buy the gas, while at the same time, when I come to a climate summit, I'm being told to keep it in the ground. What is now the direction of travel? The short answer is James, we need to lower our carbon footprint. The reality is that at the moment, Africa's carbon emission is less than 3%. Africa's agenda on climate change is essentially an adaptation agenda. I think it's quite unfair to basically put all the burden now on African nations on the 1.5 degree. I think obviously they should contribute, they should lead, but I mean there's also something from the Western world in terms of decarbonization to lead the way as well.
Are you also saying that ILC wants to answer this question on your behalf?
Well, just briefly, because I could see the moderator is here, and therefore the clock is ticking. But very quickly on the energy question, I think what has been agreed, and I think UNDP, we also on that pathway, is on just transition for Africa. And I think every country needs to define what that just transition is and their transitional plan. Many African
and ILC on just,
yeah.
What about the balance between social and environment? Do we focus on alleviating our people from poverty or saving the planet?
It has to be, or you have to balance the approach to that. I mean, that's why we call the sustainable development. You have to look at the economic and environmental and social part. So it has to be balanced. I think the point I'm trying to raise is that many African countries are already doing 90% of renewables already. We need to look at the energy mix of these countries. So if a country wants to move from charcoal to LPG, that is transition for that country. Or if that country wants to move from LPG to something else, that could be transition. So I think every country needs to define what transition means without compromising the safeguards, environmental safeguards and social safeguards. But now that I have the floor, also very quickly on the issue around the private sector, thank you very much for the reflection. But I think 3 points from me. We need to move the conversation from corporate social responsibility when it comes to climate agenda and begin to look at the value chains and the business processes along those value chains. What are the practices of the private sector? Are you impacting on deforestation as a result? And what more can you do in terms of technology?
And LC, the last two, you had the 3 points, you have made one, the last two. Because
well, I mean, look at green financing as well. What kind of instruments can you, if somebody is going to do something in that climate, what are the instruments in the bank that could be lower cost or lower interest rate? And I think those things we need to pay attention to them. And finally, private-public partnership. We need to start speaking to the government to see what can we do at scale to be able to address those climate things. But I don't know whether I'll have the floor again, but all I can say is that from our side as UNDP, and that's what you asked Dr. Mwangi, what is the UN doing? I mean, we are really behind member states now looking at facility that will support them on adaptation, looking at transition, looking at issues around NDC implementation.
Elsie, allow me, because I'd been told of a hard stop at 12:30. Yes. It's precisely 12:30. I can see it starting. Allow me to request the audience to put our hearts to appreciate this great panel, and then we'll hand over back to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As you can see, I mean, the debate can keep going and going, and we really would like to encourage every single person who is joining us, especially online. If you have any questions, any contributions, please push them on our hashtag. That is hashtag KusiFest 2022. We are going to move on directly